Very generous introduction, I have to say. That's very kind of you. And welcome everybody again. Good to see you all online, and thanks for attending that first session. Apologies if we didn't get to all the questions. Chat was going quite crazy towards the end of that session, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all those questions. As mentioned, though, through my uncle Barbara, reach out to me. I'm very happy to sort of take some time offline to help or to clarify any points that you think you want to focus on. Very happy to arrange a little bit of time to try and talk offline if that's useful to you. So please feel free to reach out. So as Mayank says, today we're going to talk quite a bit about procurement and how procurement think about engaging in supplier negotiations and how they think about supplier selection, and ultimately then think about, so if I'm a supplier looking to bid into a world where procurement are present, what are the ways I should be thinking about approaching that, and perhaps how can I think about my approach to that in a slightly more strategic way. There's a temptation for all of us as small and growing business owners to want to bid for everything, for example, and we've really got to be more selective than that. There's a temptation for us to want to go and, you know, immediately win the big contract with the big guys, and that's a great aspiration, but we need to think about whether it's feasible for us. So we're going to talk about some of those things as we go through, and as always, I will try and answer and get to as many questions coming through on the chat as possible, and we'll see if we can make it as interactive as the technology allows. So I won't go through my bio again because you'll be bored of seeing it, but the bit to focus on today, I guess, is, so I was in procurement leadership roles at GlaxoSmithKline and at Merck, and whilst at DHL running the business development team, I also set up an internal procurement group there as well. So a reasonable amount of understanding of how procurement folks think and act, and a lot of my consulting work now, whilst is probably about 50% commercial negotiations and 50% supplier type negotiations. So I'm still heavily involved in the procurement world. Okay, so today here's what we're going to do. We're going to review and understand some procurement approaches, thinking about how they think about suppliers, the whole approach to the supplier base. We're going to think about what drives procurement when they're at the table. What are the things that they're looking to achieve out of a negotiation, and we're going to also identify some strategies for dealing with those difficult tactics. So one of the things today, which hopefully we're all together again face to face at some point, but which will be a really good interactive session when we can do that, is to really start to challenge ourselves with what are those things that I find difficult to deal with when I'm sat across the table, or I'm on a phone call, or I'm on a Zoom call with somebody I'm negotiating with. And what can I do to maybe use the framework we talked about last week to help navigate some of those difficult tactics? So we'll try and make that as user-friendly as possible in this environment, but I think you'll get the message of how we can use our framework to deal with that. And then we're going to look at strategizing for negotiations, and particularly around 5 key levers, things that you can pull on to help you think differently about the strategy that you build for your negotiation. And that's really where we're going to try and get to today. I'm going to try my best to stay on time. Sorry we ran over last time, but hopefully that's because we had quite a lot of interaction and some good question and answer sessions throughout it. So we will try and get through this. In the next session, though, just to kind of highlight how these things are going to join up, we're going to talk a lot about behavior. So in the next session, we'll probably dip into a lot of areas of behavioral psychology and how we think and understand how those people we negotiate with, what's important to them, how do their brains work, how do we understand that such that we can therefore be more influential when we're talking to them. So today we talk difficult tactics and strategy. Next time we talk about, and here's how the human beings interact when they're together in a negotiation. And hopefully they will segue quite nicely over this session and next session. I'm just going to take you back through this. So you remember our whole approach to negotiation is around collaboration. There's a danger that collaboration is seen as somehow a soft approach, when in actual fact, it's very much a much harder approach to take because it's difficult to do. I was talking with somebody the other day about authoritarian leaders, and we were obviously talking about people like Trump and, dare I say, Mr. Johnson, but other leaders in history. And there's a real misunderstanding about what strength looks like. And strength is when you can bring others along with you, right? Strength is when you can get other people to move in the same direction as you, and you yourself can also understand enough about those people you're working with to move a little bit in their direction too. That's difficult to do, but outcomes are nearly always much more positive if you can behave like that. What authoritarian leaders tend to do is to shut off the sounds from the people who might have different opinions. And that often comes across and is thought of as being strength, but actually what it's saying is I can't deal with that other perspective and that other point of view, so my approach is to ignore it or is to run over it. Well, we think that's probably suboptimal. So when we think about strength in negotiations, the challenge is to get alignment and mutual understanding as early as you can, and to realize that for them to be truly successful, both parties have to be successful. And that takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of, I guess, intelligence to really try and get those things aligned. Okay. And you'll remember as well what we said last time was that preparation critical to success in anything, but particularly in negotiation. And anecdotally, most people seem to prepare for negotiations in the car or on the plane going to the meeting. Well, our kind of view is if it's important enough to go and negotiate for, it's important enough for you to find some time to really sit down and think through how you're going to conduct and execute your negotiation. And one of the things the 7 Elements does for you is give you that framework against which you can prepare. So we're just going to talk about that a little bit now, but you remember our little cartoon here. It's not enough that we succeed, cats must also fail. So that we want to break this mantra that says my success is dependent on the failure of the other party. And what we want to redefine success as is something where both parties are walking away from a table with a deal that is meeting their interests extremely well. And therefore, you are much likely to continue longer business relationships and to build greater value in your relationship than just the thing you're negotiating for at any given time. So I will just reshare this, and there we go. So this is our framework for this this form of negotiation. It's called interest-based negotiation because we focus so much on that element of interests. It's also a way of looking at negotiation as a joint problem-solving exercise. We want to be tough on the problem that we are solving for. We want to be soft on the people that we are working with. Okay, so remember that, tough on the problem, soft on the people. This is interest-based. So I need to really understand what is it I'm trying to achieve from my negotiation, and critically, what are the other party trying to achieve well. Some of that I probably know now before my negotiation, and I can start to plan around it. Some of it I'm going to have to think differently about how I engage with these counterparties so that I can understand much more about what their interests are, because it's unlikely you're going to know all of it. Oftentimes as well, I'm afraid, you will be at the table with people who don't even know what their own interests truly are. And that sounds incredulous, perhaps, but I can tell you in all my coaching and consulting experience on this, I typically have clients who will say, well, we'll spend about half an hour talking about what we want from the negotiation. And I've had those half-hour sessions last all day, because actually when you start to challenge them on what it is they're really negotiating for, there is a huge amount more there than they ever thought was the case. So in our 7-element world, here's how we look at it, right? Communication, relationships, foundational elements to get in the right place so that we can then build our negotiation work. Relationships, really nothing more at this point than How do we create an environment in which we can do business together? I don't have to like you. We don't have to get on. It's not about that side of things. It's about saying, how do we create an environment where we can do business together? Okay. We also think about communication. That's any two-way methodology that we exchange information, whether that's email, whether that's a Zoom call, whether that's face-to-face. The trick with communication, it has to be two-way. If you're not in a two-way dialogue, in a two-way communication stream, then something else is happening, but it isn't communication. So you've really got to think again about how you build those tools of communication, and we'll share a lot more about that in the behavioral session next time. And I think the other thing around communication that I often find, and will come up in our session later about difficult tactics, is silence, right? So I'm here saying two-way communication. Well, one of the most frustrating things I think we all find is silence. And that could be you're talking to somebody and they don't respond. Or it could be in this virtual world, you send an email to somebody and then you send another one and then you send another one and you get nothing back. And that feels very difficult. But and that's because it's awkward, right? It's awkward for humans to deal with silence. And when we get silence, typically what we do is we try and fill the void with something else. So one sort of word of advice on why communication has to be a two-way process is, if you come across silence when you're sat with somebody or you're on a phone call with somebody, don't feel tempted to fill that void with something else. Silence is typically used by bad actors or difficult tacticians to actually get you to concede something. And they know that if they don't say anything, you're likely to fill that void with some kind of giveaway. And you've really got to avoid that. And again, we'll build much more around communication strategy later, but there was just little kind of anecdote that I know is quite familiar to people, is we don't like the pregnant pause. We don't like the quiet on the end of the phone. But just because we don't like it doesn't mean we should fill it with a concession. So just be wary of that. One of the key tactics I was always taught when I first started in procurement at SmithKline Beecham many years ago was actually don't say so much. Because if you don't say so much, they'll say a whole lot, and you'll learn a lot more.
You're having Shona.
Oh, sorry, could someone mute, please? Thank you. Okay, so there are foundational elements. And then we step into that grey circle, and you remember we call that the circle of value, because when you're in those three elements, what you're doing is adding value to a negotiation. The key one here is the interests, okay? Interests are the reasons that we're at the table in the first place, and they're the reasons that our counterparties are at the table as well. Interests are not positions. Price, cost, numbers are not interests. They are positions that sit on top of interests. And you'll remember the iceberg diagram that we use to try and highlight this, right? So positions here are the specific things that might help us satisfy some interests, but they're not actually the interests in themselves. The interests are these underlying goals and motivations, the reasons why we might be at the table in the first place. And I think I shared with you before an example of that. So if I'm negotiating in, say, the market access space for pharmaceutical companies, the price of the medicine is what typically gets haggled over. But actually what's driving that is the need for governments to be able to manage budgets in an austerity constrained world. That's an interest. And a pharmaceutical company to recoup money spent in R&D and all these other things that they've now got to get some revenue in to try and offset. That's an interest. The actual price isn't what you're negotiating for. You're negotiating against those other interests. So always bear that in mind and try and avoid the trap of thinking about interests, but actually talking positions. The next one was options, and I'm sure you remember options here were about all the things we could do to meet those interests. So the reason it's important that we find out what the interests are is because we want to generate a load of different ways that we could actually work together to meet those interests for both parties. And then thirdly was legitimacy, and that's all the standards, all the things we can point to, external points of reference that we could use that demonstrate why something is fair. Fairness is hardwired into all primates. I've got a really interesting video that I'll try and see if we can distribute to you about a test on this. that was done by a UK scientist a few years ago. But it was really about how you can demonstrate the need for fairness as being hardwired into all primates. And what it says to us is if we're treated unfairly, it leaves a footprint with us that's hard to get over. So it's important that we make sure everything that we're trying to negotiate for is done fairly, and that we can support that with evidence. And that's really what legitimacy is. It's also important that if something's asked of us that we don't feel is fair, that we then use legitimacy to defend ourselves and say, here's why it's unfair of you to ask that of me. So that's why that's important. It's both a way of supporting our proposal. Here's why this is a good idea, legitimacy. Here's why what you've asked of me isn't actually fair, legitimacy. So really important that we remember those things about fairness and behaving in the right way. And I think I shared with you before, I have a client who feels unfairly treated by one of his customers nearly 5 years ago. And it's still to this day is when I sit down with him, the first thing that comes out of his mouth is how badly he feels he was treated. And so it does stick with us as human beings when that happens. So important that we think about that. So those three elements, interest, options, legitimacy, when you're in any of those elements, you're adding value to a negotiation. You're talking about what's important to you, what's important to them. You're coming up with lots of creative options as to how you might realize some of those things that are important, and you're supporting it with standards of fairness. The next two are around alternatives and commitments. And alternatives, we didn't get into this too deeply last time, but just to remind you, alternatives and options in the English language mean broadly the same thing. In negotiation strategy, however, they're somewhat different. Options are all the things that could be on the table, all the things that you could agree to together, things you could do as an output of your negotiation, but you'd need to do them together. Alternatives are all those things that you can do that doesn't require the other party to agree to them. And you have several of those. Often we don't think we have alternatives, but we always do. It's just that sometimes they're not particularly tenable. They're not really what we want to do. So we typically tend to ignore them. But what we want to do is actually make sure we truly understand what we could do instead of having this negotiation with this counterparty, particularly if things on the table don't look like they're going to meet our interests. If you have other ways to meet your interests that don't require a negotiation with this counterparty, then you should absolutely seriously consider what they are. And the best of all of those alternatives is called your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And you really need to invest the time to understand truly what your BATNA is, because it's a valuable tool when you're in your negotiation. It's also valuable for you to have to turn to that alternative if you can't negotiate for your interests with the counterparty that you're currently at the table with. And critically, of course, your counterparty has alternatives too, okay? And they have a BATNA too. So it's important that you try and sit and think about what could they do if they didn't do a deal with me? What do their alternatives look like? Because your job in the negotiation is to make those alternatives look less attractive to them and to make your suggestions, your options look more attractive. So you're constantly going to be thinking, if alternatives come on the table, how do I make those alternatives look less attractive? And that's what we're going to talk about in the difficult tactics section later on today. Commitments, that's really all the things that you say and do that signify agreement. Okay, it's not just the contract, but it's everything you do throughout the negotiation that signifies agreement. Okay, and the challenge with commitments is we often make commitments too soon. We often make them without really knowing whether or not we can live up to them, and we often allow ourselves, particularly as small and growing suppliers, to be forced into commitments that we're really not comfortable with. Often because frankly we're so pleased that someone's offering us some business and we want to get a foot in the door that we think yes is a good answer, but we've really got to think about that a lot more, with a lot more rigor. One of the things that difficult tacticians will do is try and cherry pick various parts of a negotiation and get you to agree. So for example, you might get to a point where someone says, hey, let's agree the price today, and then we'll look at the rest of the terms and conditions tomorrow. And the danger with that, of course, is you might agree a price today that might look okay, but then when all the terms and conditions get discussed tomorrow, you're starting to realize that that price is no longer tenable. And then you're stuck in the position of having to say, oh, I'm sorry, I've got to go back on my agreement and change that price, or you've got to live with a price that's commercially not viable for you. So our mantra there is nothing's agreed until it's all agreed, right? You want to see everything that's on the table. You want to see the value of it all. And only then do you start to make commitments. And the only one exception to that is about process. One of the things I like to do very early on, so going right back into thinking about communication and relationship, is I want to agree early on to the process that we're going to follow to negotiate against. So how are we going to negotiate comes before what we're negotiating for, in my view. And I'm happy to make a commitment to a process very early on. So here's how I want to approach this. I really want to understand more about what's important to you. I really want to understand a lot more about what the value could look like for you of an agreement we could do. And I want to do it in a collaborative way where we exchange a lot of ideas and a lot of options that might find more value for both of us. That's kind of how I'd like to do this. What do you think? And I'd be trying to push for that sort of commitment early on. Not always possible. Sometimes you're in far more transactional type negotiations. I understand that. But where you can, that's what I'd be trying to do. And that's the only commitment that I would want early on. Otherwise, I'm not making any commitments until I can see the full value of any proposed deal on the table. So important to think about commitments, commitments in that way. So that was just a quick summary of our 7 elements. Again, just to reset you on how we're thinking about it. This is a framework, not a process. And that's an important thing to think about, because we don't start at element number 1 and finish at element number 7. Arrows all over this diagram, because at any given time in a negotiation, you're going to be moving through all of these elements at different stages and in different times and in different ways. So a little bit like the analogy we used last time, there's a bit of a game of chess played here. You've got 7 pieces. They do different things for you. And depending on how you combine them and use them and how you build your skill and your ability to use them, you can do all sorts of great things with them. But it's not about saying I start at number 1 and I finish at number 7. Okay, so think about it as a framework and a guide, not as an absolute set of instructions that you have to follow in some kind of ordered process. And then I just wanted to close on this, and you'll remember this piece around what we think success looks like in a negotiation. And it starts with a negative, right? So it goes to a little bit to that thing about commitments and a little bit to that thing about alternatives. So what it says is there is no agreement. There is no agreement unless it's an agreement that's better than something I could do elsewhere. So it's better than my alternatives. That it meets my interests extremely well, not my positions, but my interests extremely well. It meets the interests of my counterparty at least acceptably. And perhaps if there are others who live with the consequences of your negotiation, you need to recognize that they have interests that you would also want to meet at least tolerably. We want to know that it's the best of lots of options that we've talked about. And you'll remember that Pareto chart we showed last time. We want to think about lots of options, as many as we can, different ways to tackle the problem that we're solving for. And we want to make sure we're choosing the best ones of those to take forward. It needs to feel legitimate, so fair. No one needs to feel like they've been taken or screwed over as part of the deal, because we know that ultimately that will come back and haunt us. And we want to make sure it involves well-planned commitments that I can achieve, live up to, and operationalize once I've made them. And we'd like to think it's where the negotiation process has been efficient, because we've got some really good communication going, and it's built a relationship that you can continue to leverage and use as you go forward, hopefully finding more value with your counterparties over time. And so it looks like this, right? A key choice. You can continue to sit on the left-hand side of this chart and haggle away on positions, what we call positional bargaining. You can argue and split the difference over prices and numbers if that's what you feel is important. And And we know that certainly out in the procurement world, but in a lot of other places too, this is how people behave. So you can go along with that, and maybe that's okay for you. I suggest it probably isn't. Or you can start to think differently about approaching your negotiations as this joint problem-solving exercise. And just one last thought here. When I started, again, just thinking back to those early days in SmithKline, my boss said to me, here's what you do when you walk in the room with a supplier. You don't say very much. You go in with the lowest number you could possibly think about, and then you just keep saying no, because then what's going to happen is they're going to keep bringing their price down. And then when you get it as far as you think is possible and credible, then you might say yes. Well, that's no way to negotiate, because ultimately either suppliers will realize it and not want to deal with you, or you'll end up with deals that simply aren't sustainable. And if there's one thing we're learning through this COVID-19 challenge, is it's customers who've got good relationships with suppliers are most likely to be the ones that get supply back when they need it, and most likely to the ones to be able to continue business even through these difficult times, because they haven't left a footprint of nickel and diming. They've left one of collaboration, and they've got relationships that mean they can do business together. And they've got a communication stream that says they can have conversations that are a little bit like, this is difficult for both of us. How do we figure out our way through it together? And I'm convinced that those types of relationships are the ones that will sustain through even this challenging time we're in right now. So I'm going to stop just for a second because I'm going to drink some coffee. Any questions, anything more on that before we move away from just the pure framework and think a little bit more about procurement?
I think David Nimisha has put a question on what happens when negotiating is not about money, convincing leadership teams about the importance of quality compliance, for example.
Yeah, so one of the things to think about, and it's a good question because it's a nice lead in, is procurement people often focus on the money, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit now. But actually underneath that, they have a lot of other requirements, and they also have to link effectively with their stakeholders. So within any business, they're probably linked into the finance department, the legal department. If it's manufacturing, possibly quality, probably risk management, et cetera, et cetera. And within those relationships with those stakeholders, they have a lot of objectives and a lot of interests that they have to meet at the negotiation table. The challenge often materializes is just the one about the price. So part of your job when you're thinking through your negotiation strategy, when you're thinking through the clever use of communication, is to start to dig underneath those positions and get into those interests and help them into that discussion. Ask some questions, get curious. I always say this to clients, get curious with the counterparties. So talk to me a little bit about what your quality program looks like, because we'd be really keen to make sure that we're compliant with that and that our products and services are meeting those needs and requirements, and draw them into that type of discussion. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is, how do you navigate more broadly across an organization? And so I'm not an advocate of saying you should avoid procurement. I've been there, so I'm kind of a little poacher term gamekeeper, if that's the phrase you want to use. I often find it now when I'm talking to clients tempting to go around procurement, because I really don't want to have to haggle on my price and that be the only reason you employ me. So I see the temptation, but what I think you need to do is to engage fully with procurement, and hopefully some of the things we're going to talk about now will help you do that. But actually then navigate around different stakeholders in those organizations. See if you can find ways to get to quality people, or risk management people, or commercial people, or whoever it is you think is going to have influence on the final decision-making process, because procurement very rarely are the decision makers. In fact, outside of a few commoditized businesses, I don't know many places where procurement actually make the decision. Okay, so important that you think differently about navigating stakeholders. We've got some good material on stakeholder strategy and stakeholder management It's typically something we do in a workshop because it requires you drawing big pictures and stuff. Let me take some thought about whether or not we can find a way to share that through a PowerPoint or some kind of presentation material. But that would be useful, and it's about navigating a broader range of stakeholders to identify those who could be positive influences for your products or services. So I'm hoping that helps a little with that question. Okay, I'm going to move us on. So let's think a little bit about procurement. So as I said, I was in procurement for probably about 15 or so years with some reasonably big companies. And I went through the kind of transformational shift that procurement undertook, I guess, towards the mid-90s when this really started. And it was a thing called process-driven procurement. And a lot of consultants, so guilty there now, of course, a lot of consultants made a lot of money on the back of selling this concept of process-driven procurement. And before procurement, it was really buying or purchasing. And that's really where it sat. And in most companies, it wasn't even a function on its own. It was typically somewhere within the business unit. So process-driven procurement did a couple of things. It typically centralized. It recognized that leverage through volume was valuable, and so tried to centralize. It also then categorized, so it put procurement spend into categories, so like facilities management or logistics or marketing services or whatever it was, but it categorized and it globalized. And that's really what happened. And then underneath that, methodologies were formed as to how do you deal with that spend with those suppliers more effectively to the benefit, obviously, of your own organization. And that went through several iterations over the following decade, I guess. And hence you get organizations now with very centralized, highly globalized procurement organizations working to a process that's called category management, where they've categorized spend and they've probably looked down through 3 layers to decide whether it's a global spend, a regional spend, or a local spend. And those things are dictated by at what point can you leverage the supply base. So if you look at something like, I don't know, travel, right? You can typically leverage some travel, like hotels, maybe at a global level, right? You could do a deal with Hilton, for example. Airlines, you can sort of leverage globally because, you know, British Airways and American Airlines and various carriers are in these alliances like the Star Alliance or whatever. But typically, actually, that's more of a regional spend because truly the pricing and the service happens at a regional level. And then you get local stuff, maybe like events management or things that can be very local. Anyway, you've got those 3 dimensions that look at global, regional, and local. And this is all about trying to understand at what point do I address the supply base? At what point are suppliers global in nature? At what point are they regional? And at what point are they local? And that's important if you're a buyer, because that actually talks to at what point you leverage the supply base as well. Am I going to do a global deal and perhaps take 50 locally based suppliers and get rid of them and have 1 or 2 global suppliers? Or is the spend and the supply base in a certain category one where I have to have local and regional players? And so those are all the types of decisions that start to emerge when you think about procurement as a category management exercise. And then what gets overlaid on that, and as we all know, pretty much championed out of the US, I guess about 20 years ago onwards, is really this idea of supplier diversity, right? So this need to recognize that really organizations should be spending money with those communities that they earn money from, so giving back to the communities that they sell into, and they should be making sure that their supply base is representative of the demographics of the countries that they operate in and the companies that they run and all of these types of things. So you've got that overlaying over the top of category management of supplier diversity. And one of the big challenges that then gives procurement people is this contradiction. And Mayank and I wrote a white paper about a year ago, which many of you might have read, which starts to talk about this contradiction. And part of the contradiction is, if you want to globalize a category, it's very hard to do that if you're having to then go and look for smaller, medium-sized suppliers because they're diverse. So if I've got two objectives, one is to leverage and globalize, but one is to make sure I'm being diverse, those two things are in conflict. So it's one of the reasons why actually diversity is very, very challenging and very hard for big organizations. There are lots of others, but that's kind of one of the key drivers from a procurement point of view. And then a lot of procurement organizations have given themselves diversity spend targets. So in the US, there's things like the $1 billion round table and all of those types of things. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but the challenge there is it drives the behavior around spend, not necessarily around capability. And it becomes a numbers game that big organizations, and I've seen them play quite a lot with numbers to make those numbers look better than perhaps the reality. But it kind of gives some false targets, I guess, is where I'm going. Anyway, so that's where we get to with procurement. So I'm suspecting that a lot of the procurement people that you meet are probably part of some kind of centralized function and are probably sat within an environment that's looking at category management as the way to manage that spend that they have a degree of control over. And they probably show up with objectives around things like savings. So procurement has tried for most of the last 10 years to detach itself from savings, because savings feels a little transactional, and quite often their own stakeholders internally don't even believe that they're delivered. However, savings are quite easy to measure and they're quite visible to the organizations that procurement people sit in. So by default, savings becomes very, very, very high on their agenda and is still probably a significant objective. And that's why you often find with procurement people, you're into cost and price quite early on in the negotiation, I would suspect, is because if they negotiate cost and price down, then they can claim savings, and most of them will have bonuses paid on, in part, an objective around savings. So some background there to think about. The other thing, though, and this goes back to that point I made about exploring interests, is that in all of my years in procurement, savings was perhaps never more than about 20% of my actual objectives as an individual. There were other things that I had to meet, things about quality, things about stakeholder engagement, things about diversity, all of those types of things. So it's important to remember that savings might be the first thing on the list for your procurement counterparties, but it's not the only thing that's important to them. So just bear that in mind when you feel yourself maybe trapped in nothing more than a price discussion with some of the procurement folks that you deal with. So what we've said here is, when you look at some of the challenges and perceptions that you have in negotiation, you're probably seeing with procurement, you're probably seeing things like a high demand for price discounts. You're probably finding them often quite insular, quite closed off, reluctant to share information. These are very old school tactics around how you drive savings and how you bang the table and deliver value from what they perceive value to be from a supplier. It's by this aggressive kind of stance. I'm giving you nothing, but if you want to work for me, you have to give me everything. That's the kind of tactics that still often get played out. So things to be aware of there. They often ask for these unrealistic commitments, like guarantees. Or they want to be able to move things around at their behest, but without actually giving you any consideration for it. I'm in a negotiation at the moment where there's a client being asked by its customer to constantly change volume, but to have no other benefit to the client for doing that. So there's often these unrealistic commitments that get asked for. Procurement people spend a lot of time, or they should do a lot of time and research trying to understand cost, right? So they think they know your costs and your margins, and they often want to pull that apart, unbundle it, and really try and then cherry pick various parts of your cost structure with a view to reducing those elements down. We call it purchase price cost analysis, PPCA it's called. And it's the process of unbundling the cost of something, stripping it down, and then individually looking at the items to see if there are places that you can actually negotiate lower prices. And then when you rebundle that together, of course, your overall bundle price should be a lot less. Purchase price cost analysis. It goes in line with another thing called should costing. And should costing is that, again, similar process where you do some research that says, what should this good or service cost me if I looked across industry benchmarks, previous prices paid, all of that type of thing? What would this cost me? And that then gives me a benchmark for what I should be negotiating for. So all of those things procurement people spend or should be spending a lot of time in. And so expect them to understand that, or think that they understand that. And therefore think to yourself about, how do I deal with that when it comes to my negotiation? What's my price structure? I better make sure I know it better than anybody else because it's mine. And I better be able to make it credible and defendable, because I don't want to get caught in some bargaining that just hammers me down on price. So whether you're offering bundled type solution pricing, project management type fee structures, or actual unit costs for a specific thing, make sure you truly understand it and expect your counterparty to understand it, even if they end up not understanding it as well as they think they do. Because from that, you will be able to exercise more power and control in the discussion. They like to compare you with competitors, and that's about that alternative play that you saw in the 7 elements, right? So when you hear them talking about competitors, what they're actually doing is going to their alternatives. They're probably using language that says, you know what, I could actually get this better from the guy down the road. And sometimes the guy down the road might have a good or a service that's exactly the same as yours, and they can do a comparison, but sometimes they actually pull out something that doesn't really compare. So they don't make proper apples to apples comparisons. They're actually comparing different things, but they're trying to use that alternative as a lever to get you somewhere into a commitment that perhaps you're not comfortable with. Because the fact of the matter is if their alternative is better than you, my advice to them would be go to your alternative. In the same way, my advice to you would be, is if this negotiation isn't getting you what you want and meeting your interest, go somewhere else, because that's where the value is. So you've got to think about that whole element of alternatives when they start to make these comparators with your competitors. They might accuse you of being unfair. They might just say you're hard to do business with. They might throw in a lot of sort of soft tactical stuff about, oh, it's hard working with you, all of those types of things. So think about that. All of these are strategies to get you somewhere that perhaps you're not willing to go. And they might try and escalate to upper management. So, well, I can't do a deal with you. I'll go and talk to your boss, right? And that's, again, an alternative play. It's called a micro alternative. It's not a full alternative. They're not walking away from you, but they're saying that actually you're not the player that I'm going to deal with. I'm going to talk to somebody else. And that's also an alternative play. So they're just some common sort of challenges and a little bit of background. But again, let's just think about some of the things that procurement people face. So as we'll talk about in the next session, getting yourself into someone else's shoes, understanding how somebody else thinks, and the challenges that somebody else has is really vital to understanding them better, and therefore being able to find collaborative ways forward together. Okay. So think for a little while about some of the challenges that procurement groups face. So they might lack organizational support. And I said this earlier, right? So very rarely are procurement people the decision makers. Often, in fact, probably as high as 90% of the time, procurement organizations have to go and beg and garner for support from their own businesses. Quite often, and I'm sure you've probably seen this, procurement people don't have a mandate to go and buy something, ironically. What they have to do is to work with their own stakeholders to get some engagement and then go and try and source where they could buy things from. So they're not empowered to actually make yes decisions on buying quite often, certainly not without the engagement and the agreement of those other parts of their company that have a vested interest in the thing that they are buying. Procurement people buy virtually nothing for themselves. They are buying on behalf of their businesses. So they have to get those stakeholders on board and aligned. And that, and I've been in some, is often a very aggressive, very difficult, very challenging internal alignment discussion that can become extremely unpleasant, right? So they're possibly talking to you with the feeling that their stakeholders are going to give them all kinds of grief if they don't do deals with the right suppliers in the right way. And their own management team are going to give them grief if they can't come up with deals that show savings and show other procurement-based objectives. And that talks to this challenge that procurement objectives, the objectives of the people you sit in front of, are often different from the objectives of the businesses they work in, which is one of the other great contradictions. And so they're trying to fight with those two things. Enlightened procurement people, and I do my best, trust me, to enlighten a lot of procurement people, they've aligned their goals and objectives to those of their business. So they're very aligned. But there's still a lot of organizations that have a set of procurement objectives and a set of business objectives. And many of those things don't align at all. In fact, some of them are in direct conflict with them. So good inquiry, good curiosity, good relationship and communication management will actually help you really get an understanding for what some of the internal challenges are. Because again, it's in your interest to actually make it easier for that procurement guy when he's back with those stakeholders. So if you can make his or her job easier by saying, so what are some of the challenges you're facing in your business? What are you trying to solve for? Well, here's some ways we could perhaps help with that. That might help him navigate his own internal challenges. And if you can facilitate that, then that's got to be in your interest. So that talks as well to this second bullet around technical requirements from the business not being complete or clear, right? So sometimes the business itself doesn't always say exactly what it wants, particularly when it comes to technical specifications, quality specifications, those types of things. And so they might not always know exactly what they should be sourcing for, what they should be negotiating for. Sounds crazy, still happens in big organizations. They've got a significant pressure around this, level playing field. So they've got to, and I think this is obviously correct, is they've got to make sure that they are dealing with suppliers equally and equitably. But then, of course, that creates challenges, not least that you can't spend the same amount of time with all your suppliers. But it makes it difficult for them to sometimes operate effectively. As we said before, they've probably got aggressive savings targets. So there's a lot of focus on things like price, less so on cost. Cost and price are two different things, but very, very much a focus on price. And I'll fully put my hand up and say that in my early days in procurement, I might be given a 50-page response to an RFQ, and I'll look at the back page first with the number on it, because that's where I'm going to make my own objective and my bonus and all those other things, right? So it's important that you recognize that those are still valuable things to a procurement person. So whilst I don't want any of you conceding on price unless it's suitable and appropriate that you do, I do want you to recognize that for the guy or girl sat across the table from you, they're looking at that very hard because they've probably been given a very aggressive savings target. Your challenge in that space, I would surmise, is to start to talk about how does savings get measured, for example? How do they realize those targets? And if you can understand a little bit more about that, I suspect you can find a lot of options that would help them meet those targets without just reducing price. Interests and options at play right there, okay? Savings targets aren't a position, they're an interest. So let me help me understand a little bit more, curiosity, communication, help me understand a little bit more about how you measured on savings and what some of your targets might be in this area. And then go to options and start thinking, well, here's some ways we might be able to look at that for you. We might be able to remap how we've positioned our product or our service in such a way that we can charge on a different type of matrix, or we can split costs over 1 year to another, or whatever it is. You might find options that help them meet those interests. Procurement organizations might lack this organizational maturity. Okay, so Really good procurement organizations have evolved a long way, and some of them have spent 20 years evolving and have truly come to places where they've got a huge amount of skill and understanding of the supply base and how to manage it effectively for their businesses. A lot of guys are way beyond worrying about savings. They're much more worried about things that we call like value beyond the contract. So innovation, bringing in new things into my organization, technology, digital transformation, all of those types of things. So those guys have long since realized that relationships are important, that working with the supplier base collaboratively is important, and that moving into these additional value levers is important. However, there's still a lot of them that aren't there. There's still a lot of them that haggle over price, that turn to reverse auctions as the only way to negotiate, and that try and depersonalize and limit the amount of interaction they have with their suppliers. And that makes them difficult to deal with. And again, just to remember that some of them are responsible for managing multiple suppliers. So they've often spread very thinly. They've been tasked time and time again with reducing headcount, with keeping their organization small and lean. And that means they're probably stretched far beyond what they can sensibly manage. But because, again, and one of the other great dilemmas that I often saw in procurement, because they are themselves a cost-saving function, they find that they have to do to themselves what they tell others to do, which is cut and cut and cut their own resources. And unfortunately, and I'm sure Mayank's seen this a few times, I certainly have, diversity resources, for example, tend to get cut early on because it feels like a soft target. So finding the right resources and having enough resources to manage multiple suppliers and the negotiations and the contracts can be challenging for them. So here's just a brief framework. Again, at the end of these sessions, we're going to send you out this material. So, and again, apologies as the consultant with the 4-box diagram, but I kind of feel compelled. So bear with me here. So, one way of thinking about procurement counterparts is to profile them, thinking about their style and their approach, and then the level of sophistication that they have. And so what we find then is organizations that have developed over time and evolved, so have become truly sophisticated, probably presenting with a much more collaborative approach, and probably think about that approach as part and parcel of how they are successful. All right, so that's their style, really. Whereas conversely, if you lack that need or that understanding of your approach, your style, and you haven't had a lot of time or investment in the development of your skills and capabilities, so your sophistication, you're probably quite adversarial in your outlook, right? So it's worth thinking a little bit about what style you're up against. Are you up against the adversarial type procurement person who's going to try and turn this into a battle, who's going to try and be the dog in the cartoon that says, right, for me to be successful, Mr. Supplier, you've got to be unsuccessful? Are they like that, or are they much more likely to have elements of sophistication and collaboration as part and parcel of the approach? And it's important to know that, because you've got to know what you're dealing with when you start to think about your negotiation strategy. And then this is one about how understanding how end users at a customer view their own procurement organization, right? So as we've said before, procurement's probably sat in its own organization. It's probably siloed to a certain degree, and it probably reaches out from its silo to try and interact with different stakeholders and build these relationships internally such that it has enough of a mandate to go to the market, to look for suppliers, and then to help engage and negotiate with those suppliers. And within that, those stakeholders see their procurement people differently, right? So some of them see them highly service orientated. So this is a back office service for me. Procurement's back office for me. So therefore they're an order taker, right? They're very transactional. You might find ones though that see their procurement people as much more of a trusted advisor. So they actually know that the procurement people know the supply market better than they do themselves, that they therefore bring value in from the supply market. They've got a diverse range of suppliers that they can turn to who can deliver high quality, innovative goods and services at acceptable prices. And they might sit in a totally different place within the mindset of their own stakeholders around something like a trusted advisor. All right. In some cases, you might see rivalries. In fact, for most of my procurement career, I felt like I was in competition with my own stakeholders sometimes as to who could do the best deal, right? Who knows more about these suppliers than the other guy? Who's going to come back with a better agreement with the better supplier? So you often get those kind of rivalries. And again, important to understand, because you don't want to get caught up in that stuff. You want to be able to navigate your way to some successful transactions and some successful deals. And if that stuff's going on, you need to take a long, hard look about whether or not that's a place you really should play. And if you decide to, how you play it successfully. And then in some organizations, you've got this kind of dead weight, where procurement's a cost center. It's not a profit center. It's a bunch of folks who say they can do a load of stuff. Procurement people are actually pretty well paid, I've got to say. So it's an expensive bunch of folks who don't do very much in some people's eyes. And so it sits in the business like a dead weight. And a lot of stakeholders don't like that. So I was at GSK for a long time, and I worked with their CEO, their last CEO, for quite a long time when I was based in Singapore. And he couldn't stand any support functions, including procurement. Literally didn't like them. And so you were always treated like you were just a burden around the organization, right? So if that's where the procurement people you're dealing with feel they are, it's going to be hard for them to navigate you successfully into the business. So you need to think about that positioning as well. Okay, right. So let's just talk about a few procurement trends. I think we've touched on some of these already, but so you start to see, or we're continuing to see this shift from cost to total value. So one of the things that we are hoping enlightened procurement organizations are doing more and more of is to think about the total cost of something and the total value of something, not just the unit price of something. So there are lots of different ways that this gets addressed and named, but it's really about looking at the total value of the relationship with a particular supplier for a particular product or service. How do I measure that value? Sometimes quite hard to do, but how am I making sure I'm seeing beyond the unit cost? So this has evolved from purely price, transactional price, kind of bartering and bargaining, through to total cost of ownership type models, where you look at the total cost of something. I've just bought a new printer for my office, by the way, expensive printer, but low cost on the ink. So I look at the total cost of the printer to run it and to operate it. So that's the total cost of operation type model. And I did that because my kids have used up all my ink for their schoolwork. So I went to the shop to buy one and was told it was £90 for a set of printing ink. Well, I had to rethink that model, right? So total cost of ownership. So then you move on and then you look beyond that at value. And the challenge with value is it's a very ambiguous word. So when you use it, make sure you know what you mean by value. What is the value of your organization? What is the value of the products and services that you deliver? Think about what that is. What is your value proposition? Because there are organizations out there who really look at that value and they think about not just what you charge, they think about what you deliver in terms of value to their business. So that's a trend we see moving forward. In some industries like pharmaceuticals, value is all you talk about. Actually, as someone selling pharmaceuticals, for example, into the NHS or into the German health service or whatever, I work with my clients who do that because what we're trying to do is talk about the value of the product, the efficacy, the human life, the health, public health value that the product offers, not the unit cost of a tablet, right? Because we know that's going to go one way and in one discussion, and it's not an appropriate discussion for medicine. So you've got to think about value propositions. We continue to see it being seen as strategic. So there is a lot more shift in saying that the act and the art of managing a supply base, an external network of partners, is a supply base of partners, is actually a strategic activity. Okay, we've seen that through outsourcing strategies and various other things, but fundamentally you see organizations starting to think more strategically about those suppliers they engage with and how they leverage value from that external network of suppliers much more strategically for their organizations. We see a growing emphasis on the strategic management of categories, which we talked about before, versus actually just being very transactional. We see that ongoing management of categories rather than just turning up and asking you for something when there's a specific RFP in play. We see a more long-term sustainable engagement with sourcing activities in the supply base. Obviously, a lot of automation. Outsourcing is still there, but depending on the industry, some have been through several cycles of outsourcing. And oftentimes you'll hear people say, oh yeah, they used to outsource that, but they brought it back in-house. So the outsourcing was a failure. Well, actually, outsourcing is one step along a planned series of activities to manage a particular requirement for your business. Sometimes it makes more sense to have it done outside. Sometimes it makes more sense to bring it in. And at the time you make those decisions, both those things are right? And it's part of a continuum. We see an increasing emphasis on collaboration, which is what we've been talking about, and trying to build those relationships. A lot more post-award performance management. So really thinking about how well do our suppliers perform for us after we've signed the contract and when we're in this life cycle of the engagement and the relationship together. And then we see this continued investment in procurement talent. So procurement category manager roles, procurement director, category director roles, they're highly paid, highly skilled jobs now. So we see a lot of that academia, degree level, master's level degrees in procurement and supply chain are quite common now. So it's becoming very much a function and a skill set all of its own. So I won't touch on these too much because we're going to move on a little bit, just conscious of time. So priorities around continuing to deliver savings, thinking about continuity, and then we're seeing, so they're all kind of enterprise type priorities, delivering innovation, for example. And then we see procurement internal priorities around, they want to be seen as strategic, constantly looking for that credibility within their own organizations. They want to think about their span of control. They want to think about how they continue to attract and look like the place that high talent comes to work in, and that they've got real strategic future for the business. So some thoughts there. And then just let's start to think about some strategies, okay? So we talked about this before in terms of where your procurement folks might sit on these various different diagrams. So if you've got a highly sophisticated procurement organization and they've got quite a lot of power and influence, then we really see that as a collaborative and cooperative kind of environment for you to think about. If they're lacking power and they're lacking sophistication, we put work around here. I think it's more about work with and around, and that's where you need to start to think about truly engaging with different stakeholders, not just procurement. So when we say work around, we're not saying avoid, because I think that's wrong, and it'd be hard to avoid them if they have got some kind of mandate to be part of a negotiation. But you would want to think about, how do I engage with others in that organization such that I'm not just reliant on an unsophisticated, uninfluential procurement person to make the decision about whether or not I win some business here or not. So think about where your procurement organization might sit. If you get the chance to engage, ask questions, get that curiosity going. Don't interrogate, but start to think cleverly about the use of communication to try and understand what's motivating them at the table, what their personal and organizational goals are, and perhaps try and understand where they sit within this business that you're trying to deal with. Are they a silo with no power and with very little credibility? Or are they a very highly influential bunch of experts who truly are adding value to their business stakeholders? Think about those dynamics, because that helps you strategize. So I'm just going to build this up, just a little kind of flow chart to think about deciding if and how to respond to RFPs. And something that I see often is, particularly with, and I do it myself with my own business, by the way, is we kind of get stuck in the yes sort of boxes here, is that we want to respond to everything. We obviously want to win as much as we can. That makes sense. But sometimes we can forget some realities within that. So, I really would encourage some real thought about, your time's valuable and you haven't got lots of resources. So the real message here is to say, how do I focus the resources I've got and go deep and strong into areas that I can probably stand a chance of winning, versus going broad and shallow across a lot of areas that I might not win, or I might target organizations that simply, no matter how much I'd like them to, aren't yet going to consider me seriously. And that could be because I don't have enough of a network within that organization. It could be because they are highly globalized in their outlook and they're just going to look at the big players. It could be lots of reasons. And part of your challenge, of course, is to try and understand those before you get too far down the line of wasting time and resource on RFPs that you're not going to win. So thinking about, should we respond? Think about those initial questions. Can we win, and do we want to win, right? So here's some good examples. So when I was in logistics with DHL, we started bidding for some work with Walmart in China, when Walmart really started to open up with China. And actually, not long into the bid, we realized that we didn't want it, all right? So even if we could be successful, which we probably could have been, we didn't want it. And we didn't want it because we knew that Walmart's strategy was going to be pounds and pennies every single conversation, that they were going to cut everything to the bone in terms of our ability to make a margin, that they were going to drive us to levels of service that we couldn't sustain with the types of pricing that they were expecting. And therefore, despite the fact that having Walmart on our list of clients would be fantastic, and that the revenue opportunity was many millions of dollars, the value to us was actually quite low when we really sat and honestly looked at it. And so we stepped back from that. Equally, I did one with Apple. And Apple did an online auction for some air freight services. I think it was out of Singapore at the time. And so we went online and did our bidding thing online and got our price to where we were comfortable with. And we were pretty close to being the lowest, but never be the lowest in those things, by the way. But we were certainly within the range at the bottom of the curve there. And then the next day, Apple phoned up and said, right, so what's your real price? And of course, that said two things to me. Firstly, if this is how you deal, this isn't how we want to deal. That's not fair, and that's a legitimacy issue for me right there. Secondly, again, all they're going to do is spend their time not looking at the value, not looking at the quality of the service. We're going to be constantly met with issues over price and reducing price, and that's not where we want to be. So think about that. Can we win, and do we want to win? And is it a good use of our resources, given everything else that we've got going on and given the limitation we probably have on resources? So obviously, if that's a no, then you need to talk to the customer. It doesn't mean it's the end of the conversation. Think about relationship and communication. Those two things still happen, even if you're not actually transacting business together. Continue those things. Be communicative, stay in that mix, stay in that network, continue to do that. Build that relationship, build that communication stream, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And if it's yes, then what you really need to think about is, if I respond to that, can I use it to create a compelling case for me versus my competitors? Will I be able to be compelling in that environment? And will it allow us to propose a solution that actually meets the customer's needs? So can I actually truly do what they want us to do? And what's written in the RFP might not be exactly what they need, which again says, if you can, more communication, more dialogue, more inquiry, more curiosity, super important. And then we want to think about, if that's a no, well, again, continue to build that relationship. So tell them why, but then think about this idea of some disruptive responses. And I've seen this be quite successful before, which is to say, hey, I'm really sorry, but against the criteria of your RFP, I don't think we can do that. However, if what you're to achieve, Mr. Customer, is X, Y, and Z, well, here's a way we could do that. And submit a disruptive response. So it says you still very much want to be at the table. You can't do exactly what they're asking in the way they're asking it, but hey, you could do something that might meet those needs in a different way that they've not yet thought about. And in a way, that's a type of options. That's a bit like playing with the element of options. It's saying, I think I understand your interests, but here's a different way that I could approach it with my organization that might have value to you. It's just not the way you've asked us to respond in the RFQ. And I've seen that be super successful, particularly if you can get it into a broad range of stakeholders in an organization. And then, of course, if it's a yes, think about, in response to an RFX, have I answered all the questions? Have we differentiated ourselves? You know, who else do we think is responding, and how do we make our proposition look better? And perhaps without being, you know, calling out names and being unethical, how do we sort of put implications and suggestions there that the competition's capabilities are less good than ours? How do we start to anticipate then, you know, what we might have to meet in terms of objectives, and how we handle objections, and also thinking about concessions and how we might position ourselves for the negotiation that's likely then to follow the submission of the RFP. So just some thoughts there. And again, I think the ones there that are super important are, should you do it in the first place? Is it a good use of time and resources because you genuinely think you could win and it's the sort of business that you want? And at what point might it be in your interest to submit a disruptive response, not just a stock response that will get measured with everybody else, particularly if you feel you might not show up as strongly against the RFP as some of your competitors? Okay, we're going to look at difficult tactics quickly. And this is going to take us back to the 7-element framework and how we use it when we're facing difficult tactics. So there are 3 dimensions to negotiation challenges, right? Well, we might get challenged tactically, we might get challenged on a personal, interpersonal level, and we might get challenged structurally, right? So tactical things are specific things that our counterparts do that we find difficult, right? So they might get positional. They might threaten to go to our alternative. They might take us to say, you know, brinkmanship, right? Get me a response by 12 o'clock today or else you're not in the deal. All those are tactics. Interpersonal things are things that touch on our sort of emotions. And again, in the next session, we'll start to talk more about that kind of personal side of negotiations. But they might start with, you know, things like personal attacks, for example. I've been in many negotiations, certainly in my younger days, where things got quite angry and quite heated, you know, and that's an interpersonal challenge that we have to deal with in negotiations. Arguably, we shouldn't have to, but oftentimes negotiations are highly sensitive and highly fraught. So it's not unusual that people start to get interpersonal when we're in those discussions. And then the third thing is about structural, right? So where there are structural things, and we talked about some of these before. So maybe there's a lack of alignment within our client's organization. So there are things there that are difficult. The finance guy wants one thing, the procurement guy wants another, the quality person wants something different. Those structural challenges often make negotiations difficult for us. So these are some of the dimensions that we see as challenging. And here's what we need to think about, right? So as with everything, we've got to take a step back and avoid reacting. And of course, this is really easy for me to say, but when we're all in the middle of a negotiation, particularly if it's a face-to-face encounter in some way, and we've only got so much time and we're desperate to win it because it's super important for our business development goals. And the challenge is we get reactionary, right? And that's where we can very quickly end up effectively haggling or bargaining again, because what happens is when you get challenged with something, if you react to it, you're just actually doing the same thing back. And you get to play this game of ping pong across the table of reactions. And we don't want reactions. We want proactive thought, and we want responses that actually deal with the problem, not the people. We want to be tough on the problem, soft on the people. So you've always got to take that step back, take that deep breath and think about what's just come across the table at me. It might be making me personally angry or frustrated or upset or whatever, but my response needs to be logical and thoughtful. So I need to draw a breath. Sometimes that's as little as just sitting back and thinking for a second. Sometimes it's, hey, maybe time for a bio break, maybe time to get a coffee, and then we can regroup. We want to think about which of the elements are being used and why. So it's highly likely your counterparties don't know what the 7 elements are. But as we said at the start of the last session, the 7 elements are present in every single negotiation you've ever been in. You just don't realize it. Well, now that you do realize it, it's important to see which ones are at play. You know, are they using alternatives a lot, for example? Are they going, oh, I can go to the guy down the road? Or actually, I don't need you. I could do it a different way. That's alternatives. And if you can identify that, you can start to strategize for how you deal with it. You want to diagnose the difficult behavior. Is it because they're anxious? Is it because they don't know enough? Is it because they lack the skills to negotiate in a different way? What's going on there? So let's try and understand why these behaviors are materializing. You want to think about, hey, if I play along with this game, does that add value to me? Does that help me meet my negotiation goals? Or am I better off now my time and my skill in changing the game they're playing? So taking maybe a highly transactional, tactical bargaining session and turning it into a collaborative discussion about mutual interests. Would that be more valuable to me? Change the different elements that are being used. So for example, if we're caught up in an element of alternatives, hey, I can go to your counterpart down the road. He's much cheaper and much faster than you are. Well, the way to deal with that is to change the element. That's an alternative element. I might go to legitimacy and say, well, yeah, true, you could go down to the guy down the road, but have you thought about how much it would cost you to try and re-engage with that? How much it would cost you to negotiate? How much time it would take to renegotiate with somebody else? For example, that's a legitimacy play. I might go to relationship and say, yeah, but we've been talking for quite a long while. We've started to understand each other now. So maybe actually it's better if we could just continue a little bit longer. That's taking it up to relationship. Yeah, we might go to interests. Hey, you could go to the guy down the road, but my understanding of what's important to you is X, Y, and Z. And I think you can see that we can deliver X, Y, and Z. And I suspect that the guy down the road can only do X and Y. So perhaps it's better we stay a little bit longer at the table and really think about how we can structure something together. So think about elements and how you change and move around that framework. Then there's a thing around what we call naming the game, right? So kind of calling it out. And I think this takes quite a lot of courage to do, but it's particularly useful when there's some very bad interpersonal behaviors happening, right? So if somebody's presenting as angry or frustrating or rude or impolite, all those things, you don't have to deal with that. You can if you want to, and if it's something that you're comfortable with, but if you're not, call it out, right? And you don't want to point fingers and be accusative, but you could say, hey, you know what, I find that approach a little bit hard to deal with. I find that slightly offensive, or I find that slightly rude, if you don't mind me saying so. So if we could we perhaps think about talking about this in a different way, okay? Very difficult, even for quite severe and aggressive people, to continue when they've been challenged with their own behavior. So calling out, naming the game, quite an important tactic that we can use. And then continue this thought about balancing persistence and agility, right? So you want to stay at the table as long as it's valuable for you to do so. The moment it's not valuable, pull your alternative and walk away. But as long as it's valuable for you to do so, you need to stay at the table. However, to stay at the table, you might have to be super agile to move around. So you've got to think about how you do that. And then in all of that, you've got to think the point at which my time and effort in this discussion is not going to be rewarded is the point I need to look at my alternative very strongly and decide if it's better for me to go somewhere else than to continue to be persistent here. Okay, so I'm just going to flash these up and just try. This is something that normally I'd like to do with you in a room, but we're going to try and do this virtually. So here are some of the things that tough negotiators might say. We can look at your product later. We need a lower price. We don't see the benefit of your product at this price, right? This price isn't cost effective for us. All these types of statements are difficult tactics. And when we can map these against the circle of value, right? So we will only pay what you charged in this other market. So maybe you sell something in France for a different price than you sell in the UK. I don't know, but as an example, right? Well, that's really something that's trying to get you to commitment. It's a commitment play, right? It's saying we could do a deal, but only at the price that you charge somewhere else. It's commitments. So it's down here in the bottom right. We don't see a benefit from your product at this price, okay? That's partly an alternative. It's suggesting that there's another product at a better price that they could use. It's also, again, partly trying to get you to a commitment. And all of these, by the way, because of the way they're probably delivered, they impact communication and they also impact your ability to build relationship. Our experts see gaps in your data. So perhaps you're in a highly technical space, right? So Maybe there's something that we need to see more, right? So what more can we get from you? Some of that's about legitimacy, right? A little bit. And some of it, again, is about trying to move you forward into commitment, or to suggest that actually there are alternative players out there who perhaps have better data. We're happy to use your competitor's product instead. It's a clear alternative play, right? So we could go to the guy down the road. We're very happy to use that. It's an alternative play with a suggestion that actually, but if you were to commit to something better now, we could stay here with you. So it toggles between alternatives and commitments. At this price, we don't see cost effectiveness. All right. So again, they're challenging your legitimacy, saying that at this price, it's not cost effective. They're very positional. They're talking about price, and they're really thinking about getting you to commit to something lower than that. Need a lower price? Similar comment, right? If you valued our working relationship, you'd make a better offer. So they're challenging the relationship element, and they're trying to get you to commit to something at a lower price. We see a huge potential budget impact. So using you would cost us a lot of money. Again, a suggestion on alternative, a touch on interests in fairness there, and again, trying to move you to a commitment on something different. We want your lowest price and then we'll decide. Very much a commitment play. Okay, so what's important in all of those, and it's hard to show on this screen, is that those things typically sit somewhere around alternatives or commitments. So a do it or else, a take it or leave it strategy is an alternative commitment play. That's where it sits in the 7 elements, right? And often those things challenge relationship because they're usually aggressive, and they're usually delivered in quite an aggressive way. So they challenge communication as well. And what you therefore should be able to see is that those 4 things sit outside the circle of value. So the lesson here, when you're looking at this framework, is to recognize that difficult tactics nearly always, probably over 90% of the time, touch on those elements that sit outside of the circle of value: relationship, communication, alternatives, commitments. Particularly take it or leave it statements, they are an alternative commitment play, okay? The challenge, therefore, is if you want to continue to drive value into the discussion, you've got to move that counterparty into interest options or legitimacy. So the key to dealing with difficult tactics is to recognize the element, which I guarantee you will almost certainly be those 4 boxes outside of that circle, and then think about strategies you can use to get them back into the circle and back onto topics that add value. Yes, you could use an alternative, but help me understand how that's going to meet the interests that you've told me are important to you, because I don't think our competitor has all of those capabilities. Legitimacy, here's some examples of why I think that's true. Maybe there's some other ways that we could talk about how we engage together. Options. In those statements, you've instantly moved away from alternatives and you've got into interest options and legitimacy. You've started to re-navigate the negotiation using the framework as the tool to help you think differently and hopefully bring your counterparty along. Now, don't get me wrong. When you try this first time, it's not going to magically turn a transactional bargaining session into some kind of strategic collaboration session. This takes time, practice, and persistence. And at some point, you might find it shifts into that positive value-adding discussion. I hope it does. I believe it will. At some point, it might not move at all. And at that point, again, your strategy is to think long and hard about, have I got the relationship that's good for me, that's going to generate business for me? Possibly not. The communication feels like it isn't working. We're not actually talking about interests. We're talking about positions. They're stopping me putting options on the table, and the way that we're dealing with this doesn't feel that fair. I might be better with my alternative, and therefore I'm unlikely to make a commitment to do anything here other than to step away. That's how you need to think about it, and go back to that statement we made that said no deal unless it's a deal that meets your interests, that's got lots of good options in it, and it's fair, and it's better than your alternatives. So hopefully that was clear. That would normally be a fantastically enjoyable flip chart session, but hopefully that kind of worked. Okay, so I won't belabor these because we've talked about them a fair bit already. I did just want to talk. I'm aware we're about 5 minutes away from time, but we're going to spend only about 10 minutes now just closing out by thinking about the negotiation process, and I hope that's okay for everybody. And sorry that I constantly fail to meet the agreed timeline. So we want to think about negotiation strategy. Okay, so strategies are high-level plans where we look at choices of possible actions that could achieve our objectives. Okay, so we want to think really about what a strategic approach is. And when we think about a negotiation strategy, we want to think about our goals. Oftentimes, it's very rare that we actually not only do we not prepare, but we actually don't really think about what am I trying to achieve? What are my actual goals for this negotiation? We want to understand the broader context that the negotiation takes place in. So what's relevant at the time and place that we negotiate to both parties? What things are going on in the environment? What's important in the worlds of both organizations that we need to think about? We want to think about actions and reactions of our counterparts. So if we can preempt some of them, we can be prepared for them. And we want to think about lots of different paths, right? And lots of different ways that we might think about deployment of our resources. And this is really how it starts to look. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a complicated slide, but it gives us some levers on what we can play with, right? So we want to think about value to them and value to us, right? So what are those values? We want to think about all the different options that could deliver against those value criteria. We want to think about how much leverage we have and how much we might want to increase leverage or decrease leverage, and think about those. We want to think about scope. How much do I increase scope and how much do I decrease scope? And we can make choices around those, and that's how we start to build our negotiation strategy. And I'll just try and explain that a little bit more in these slides here. Okay, so these are our 5 levers that we can play with. Leverage, right? So can I increase it or should I decrease it? And how much should I do that, right? So for example, I can increase leverage by thinking about how my goods and services are actually much more vital and critical to this client than perhaps they think they are. And perhaps I could add more goods and services to really help increase the value that I offer to this client in this negotiation. Equally, I might want to say there's more value or more opportunity for me in really limiting this down and saying, actually, you know, this could be, we want this for a 1-year deal, not a 3-year deal, right? We want to change the dynamic because there might be something in that that actually makes it more likely that you win, and actually might be more conducive to your business goals. So leverage can happen both ways. You can increase it, you can decrease it. Similarly with scope, right? We could have a broad scope of a lot of products and services that we might want to offer, or we might narrow it down and be super brilliant at just one of them. And we can think about how we broaden or narrow those things. Timing, when it's in our control, and there are ways we can use to put it in our control, we can think about, do we move through this quickly? Do we take our time? Are there certain points in the calendar that are super important in time, like a month end or a year end or something like that? Or are there things that we can use differently in time, like, you know, cutting a contract across 2 financial years so the budget impact in 1 year is less than if they were seeing the whole thing in that same year? So we can play with time as a key lever. We can think about the parties. So who's involved? Who have I got at the table from my side? Have I got the right seniority? Have I got the right skills and expertise? Should I bring in some kind of external support? What does that look like? And I can play with that dynamic. And then finally, thinking about information, right? So what does our information flow look like? Okay, are we going to limit it very much to just the information regarding this one thing that we're talking about? Or are we going to talk much more broadly and demonstrate an expertise and an understanding and share much more information about a slightly broader range of topics that are relevant to this particular client? Equally on that one, we want to think about not just what we share, but what do we ask for? Do I ask for very limited information, just narrow enough to help me understand this one thing? Or do I actually try and use this negotiation to understand far more about this client and find far more about what they want in terms of goods and services? And I think what you can then start to see is these 5 things are clearly interwoven. So the amount of product or services we want to offer might be a bit dictated by how much information is flowing between the two parties and how much we broaden or restrict that. The time that's taken might have something to do with, the parties who need to be involved and how difficult it is to get those parties together, for example. So there are different ways to play with these levers, but they are all interconnected in some way. And what I want to think about is that all of those things you have a degree of control over. And the challenges ahead of your negotiation is, how do I think about how to exert that control? To what degree do I have that control? And thirdly, to what degree do I then increase or decrease one of those particular levers to help support my negotiation strategy and make me more effective? Okay. I'm going to leave us there for today. Hopefully that's okay. And hopefully that was useful. Mayank, I'm happy to spend a few more minutes on the call. I can't see questions on my screen for some reason. I suspect there are lots, and I suspect I've spoken too much. But if there's any we want to share now, I'm happy to do so.
Hi, David. Oh, is there an audience?
Hello.
Hi, just thank you very much for that presentation. That was just excellent. It's just so much gold stuff in there to really work on. I've got a bit of a peculiar situation at the moment where I'm managing to get an exclusivity with a client, but they percentage we agreed on it. I've got a really good relationship with the CEO, but it's the HR people that have been quite awkward. I think they feel confident they can do the work themselves. So what they've done is they're just sitting on my candidates, and it's been weeks and weeks now. What I failed to do is agree maybe an SLA at the beginning to say, look, this is how many, after a couple of weeks, these are the number of weeks you've got to be able to feedback. So I think they're just playing a game of whether I will then go, oh, okay, I'll drop my fees. I don't know. I'm just sitting there, and I feel like they don't react, but it's really hard to keep my tongue from saying, from walking away.
So you've got some areas around there that specifically talk to legitimacy, right? And so, okay, there's an omission somewhere earlier on in the process about something like an SLA or whatever it's called in your industry, right? However, sounds like an honest and fair omission, and that's reciprocal, which is, I would have thought the HR department of any credible organization would have sort of asked around it as well, because these things work in both for both parties. I would suggest it's fair to call it out. I would suggest it's fair to say that it's fair that you call it out, and that there is plenty of precedence within your industry that says these things are typically something we would expect to put in place. I might want to fall on my sword a little bit and say, look, really sorry, it didn't come up in our process and our due diligence. Typically, we would have this with our clients, and try and move them along the road of saying, yeah, actually, this is something that should be in there, and they might reconsider. And see how that type of engagement might go if you haven't already tried that. Clearly, you've got business there that I guess you don't want to lose, but equally, you don't want to be taken for a ride either, right?
Yeah. Would you advise to go to the CEO who my relationship is stronger with? I mean, without...
No, well, that's difficult if you do that in the first instance. What I might want to do is use my communication cleverly and think of a way to re-engage with the HR stakeholders, talk about the legitimacy, the fairness of needing this piece of, this documentation in place, and that it's typical for your industry, etc. And in some way, if you can, suggest or remind them of your relationship with the CEO, as long as that's done as a business relationship, not that he's your drinking buddy or whatever he is, right? Or she, sorry. So then that gives you a little bit more sort of extra leverage to say, because the implication then is, actually, we both know this is something fair that should be in place. It is legitimate, and I've got other places to go that I could pursue if I don't get what I need from you. But I'd do that, but I'd probably wrap all that up with a good degree of acknowledgement and say, look, we should have picked this up in our processes. Sorry, it clearly didn't get picked up in yours either, right? That's a way of sort of sharing the burden, as it were. However, this is something that is standard in our industry, and we do need to get it in place. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Hi, David. Kishan here.
Hi.
Thank you for your, the 2 sessions so far. They've actually been really, really insightful to someone that's quite new in the procurement industry. And, as someone that doesn't really understand the procurement industry and is going through that process, it's very eye-opening as to, the pillars that you talk about. I had a quick question, actually. Say, for example, you're working on an RFQ and the deadline is very, very tight, but your relationship with your client is very good. How do you respond in a way where you don't really want to give an answer to the RFQ, but you don't want to jeopardize the relationship either?
So are you saying you don't want to give an answer because you don't want to respond, you don't want to provide those goods and services, or you just don't like the RFQ?
I'd say it's given the fact that when you're in medical sales, the deadline is so short. For example, you'd be given 3 days. And for you to try and get that information that, some clients ask for within that 3-day parameter, it's very, very hard.
Yeah.
So sometimes you don't want to give that response because you genuinely don't want to give a half an answer as opposed to a full RFQ. So I don't know if you had any advice on how you would.
Yeah, exactly. So what you just said is absolutely fair and right, by the way. So I would give a response, but I would say that my response is that we believe we can deliver against X, Y, and Z as requested in your RFP. But as you might understand, Mr. Client, this is a highly technical, highly complex area. And the last thing we want to do is to give you information that isn't exactly true or been sense checked, right? To do that will take 5 days, not 3. Give them an alternative of another option, of what you're proposing. So if you want to respond and your intention is to respond, but it's going to take you a week, not 3 days, say that, but legitimize why that's appropriate.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay.
Anyone else? I think, David, one of the things that you mentioned about when you showed that chart about how procurement is positioned within the organization, and I was looking at that, and one of the options was trusted advisors. And I think, when I reflect back on MSD UK, where we have so many corporate clients, some of them are very engaged, some of them are less engaged, and some of them are just ticking the box. Let's be honest with that. And I think what I see is those who are really engaged, because most of the time we deal with procurement teams, who are responsible for supplier diversity. When I look back at that, I think those who are really engaged are the trusted advisors within their organizations.
Yes.
And that's where they make a big impact, because they have a very good relationship with the budget holders internally, who consider them as trusted advisor, and they listen to them when they go out and recommend a minority supplier. So I think that's a really interesting insight.
Thank you. And I think that's true. And I think you can also see the parallel of that plus with the level to which procurement have become strategic, right? So where procurement are truly strategic and they're a trusted advisor, you should see a much greater and sustained involvement in the whole diversity agenda, right? Along with a whole nother range of other more strategic objectives. The way to see that where that isn't in place is the moment that things get difficult, and now is a good time to see what difficult looks like, is you see people bailing out or less engaged, and that's because they've instantly had to revert to tactical behavior because they haven't established themselves strongly enough as a strategic trusted advisor with a well-managed supply base. They're still highly transactional. And I think, as we said offline, Mayank, the guys who've been axing their suppliers using force majeure as the excuse over the last 4 or 5 months will be the ones who find it harder to come out of this this depression when it happens, because they won't be able to turn on supply as easily. And I think that, that's something that we will clearly see materialize. Those that have had strategic relationships, that have sat down with suppliers and said, hey, this is tough. It's tough for you and it's tough for me. How do we work through this together? They'll be faster and quicker out the other end of this. I'm convinced of it.
Right.
David?
So, Anyone else?
Yeah, just quickly. As you mentioned, most of us are small and medium-sized business owners, and we don't have our own procurement team. How important or useful is it to get somebody like yourself to come in and advise and help us in that process? I mean, yeah.
So procurement for me, right, is a capability, not a function, and that puts me at odds sometimes with my CPO friends, right? And what I do for smaller businesses is advise around how you build the procurement capability within your team, and not to come in and say you need to go category management and to hire a load of procurement people. So, for example, with a biotech startup in California I worked with a year ago, literally what we did was embed in their existing teams some of the skills and capabilities to buy well and to build good relationships with suppliers, and then let the business get on with that, not to say you need a function to go do that. So I think there are ways that we can certainly help. I can certainly help you think about that. And it doesn't mean that what you should do is go and hire folks. I think it means you engage with some technology possibly, but then you just teach the people you've got how to be good at procurement when they need to be.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I think, Yemi, to answer your question, whether MST UK do deliver training to corporates, we do that on a regular basis. In fact, in many times we use David to moderate those sessions, because this is about encouraging them to understand good practices, but also learn from each other. So the peer-to-peer learning within corporate world is very important, and because that's how you influence others who are not the sort of trusted advisor to move. How can they move to that position where they are trusted by the business? So we leverage David's experience in running corporate training sessions also.
Okay, brilliant. Just one last question. Do you get access to know what their budgeted amount is for diversity suppliers?
Not directly, but what happens is that when they inform us about any upcoming RFPs, they do mention about the value of that contract. But at the same time, we give them an option whether they want us to disclose that when we go out and share that opportunity with you. So in many cases, we do know what their budget is in various categories. And it's again with those who are trusted, who are much more advanced in supplier diversity. And I think what we are seeing is that there's a growing number of corporates now. If I look back and compare that with 5 years back, I think there are more and more corporates who are now sharing and much more transparent in the sharing their budgets and their category spend, etc.
I think the other thing, though, just to pick up on that, if you don't mind, is just to remind yourself, regardless of whether they know or have or are out there looking for diverse suppliers, in any response or engagement, early on in my preamble, I would talk about my organization, which includes talking about whether you're diverse or not. Very valid to me to start off a preamble back to a client, either as a formal response to an RFP or as a general introduction to say, we're a female-owned business, or we're a diverse business, or whatever, just because then it's right out there in front of them. So even if they hadn't thought about the needs to engage with diversity, you've already given them one thing that they actually need, whether they realize it or not, right? And you've already put yourself potentially in front of other suppliers who aren't diverse, right? So you've given them a tick in the box before they've even asked for it. So get it out there quite early on, right? It's not about positive discrimination. It's about talking about you and who you are and the values of your business. And in that, you will help them achieve some of their own goals, even if they don't realize they've got.
I think, David, you made a very important point, and this is about certification. MST UK certifies minority businesses. There are other organizations that certify other types of minority businesses, whether women-owned, etc. And I always say to our businesses that when you are completing an RFP, don't shy away from mentioning that you are a diverse business, because no one has this positive discrimination or preferential procurement strategy in this country because it's not legislated. But they do have weightage when they look at the RFPs if you are a diverse business. And also use the diverse certified logo on your signatures, because this is how you are going to market. Use certification as a marketing tool, because I think that's going to be really important. Brilliant. So, David, once again, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
It was really insightful, and I'm sure businesses that attended today really got so much out of this, and I look forward to the next one.
Likewise. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.